Today, I am joined by Emmet Penney. Emmet is the host of the Ex-haust podcast, editor-in-chief at Gridbrief, contributing editor at Compact, and nuclear barbarian. Welcome, Emmet.
Hey, great to be here, Alex. Thanks so much.
I'm really happy to have you on. This has been kind of floating in my consciousness for a while to create this episode, to bring you on so you could deliver your unique expertise about something that is a little bit less airy-fairy than the general subjects that this podcast covers. Not that they're not serious, but
Sure.
they're a little bit more, less tied to the brass tacks of living life in reality. And your beat is energy.
That's right.
Before we start with all of your pronouncements about energy, how did you get this beat? How come this is interesting
Yeah,
to
how
you?
come? That's a great question. I ask myself that all the time. Yeah, so like, in some way, I have no idea how I ended up here. I have like 2 liberal arts degrees, right? Like, I'm not a technical guy or any of that. What happened was in 2017, I wrote a piece for Paste magazine when I was still very much like a DSA type called Lecture Porn: The Vulgar Art of Liberal Narcissism. And that was sort of in the moment where there was a big inventory taking on the mistakes the lefts and Democrats had been making, especially after 2016. And I was just working at a bookstore, and I got a DM about it from a guy named Michael Schellenberger. And he was like, "What are you doing right now?" And I was like, "Nothing," which was a lie. I was working, but I didn't have a phone. It was broken, and I didn't have the money to replace it because I worked at a bookstore. So I gave him the number for the bookstore I worked at in Santa Fe and had the shipping guy cover the register while I talked to him for an hour and a half, pretending I was doing a Penguin Random House order every time my boss got near me. And he was sort of like, "What are you interested in?" And I can't even remember what I said. And he was like, "Yeah, I don't care about that." He was like, "What?" He was like, "What do you think about? What do you think about nuclear?" And I was like, "That it's bad." I was like, "Do we even still do that anymore?" And he was like, "Okay, here's why it's awesome." Like blah blah blah. He was like, "Why don't you come out?" He's like, "Why don't you read these books?" He's like, "Don't take it from me. There's a lefty guy, Lee Phillips, you might be interested in. Read his book. Check all this out. And then why don't you come out to the Bay Area and we'll see if we can't work together." And that didn't pan out. I got to get nuke pilled and like meet people who've now become lifelong friends. But it wasn't until a few years later when my wife and I had lost our jobs working for a company that fell apart, and she started her own business, and I called him and I said, "Hey, you should hire me," because we'd remained friends. And he said, "You're right, I should, because I'm about to write a book." And that book was Apocalypse Never. And so that working on the research team for that really gave me sort of a baseline of knowledge that I just did not have before. Like I was a fan of nuclear, I'd been convinced, but I still hadn't gotten my reps in. And then COVID happened. I didn't know what to do. I had lost my job again. I started Exhaust, my podcast about why nothing feels possible. And then he called me up when he wanted to write his second book, San Francisco, towards the end of his drafting process. And he was like, "Hey, I just need you to look over it and to like give me some feedback." So I worked on that book too. And then after that, it was sort of like, well, what am I going to do? Like that was a contract. And I decided that I wanted to sort of create my own spin on what a nuclear future would look like. I am, unlike a lot of people in the nuclear space, I don't believe in the progressive view of history. And so I don't have the sort of utilitarian easing the pain of life by supplying material goods. I think material goods are good, but they're not everything. Um, and I'm like not convinced that human nature is in flux towards progress. And I just have like this different view of it where I don't think big things are evil necessarily. I'm very concerned with big national projects. And I think that long time horizons, which nuclear sort of requires, are beneficial to the long term health of society because I would very much like to see America as a society continue. And so that's what I wanted to bring to nuclear advocacy. And then I sort of do that on the side. I write all of this other stuff about nuclear or the grid, and then I've co-founded a company called Gridbrief where I do a daily newsletter and I'm the editor in chief there. So that's sort of like the shortest possible version of how I got here, a mix of like accident, luck, and instinct. And yeah, now it's my life's work. I wake up thinking about like gas flows from Nord Stream 1 or whatever. So that's my life now.
That's good. I'm happy you're the person, on the job thinking about these things because there's not many of you, at least as far as I know. That's why, a big purpose of this episode is to illuminate, people like me who don't know much about this subject and probably some out. I'm sure some are knowledgeable, but the people who don't know everything about the energy grid and how it all hangs together, listen to this, guys. So what do you think is the kind of the most important blind spot that people have related to energy and the grid? Like, what's kind of an aha moment for a lot of people that just don't get?
Yeah, hold on. Let me think because I've had a few aha moments sort of going through. And I think what's difficult for people to understand is sort of the electric grid as a system that has certain inputs and the things it needs. So, like in the US, it needs to stay at like 60 hertz so that it can send, electricity down the wires so they can show up in your house. That's a very shortened version of what happens there. And you can't just do whatever you want to it. I think there's sort of like a cavalier nature, especially when it comes to things like renewables, that you can sort of just put in whatever inputs on the grid and then it sort of all works out. And that's because the process is like very obscured from you, you know. Like by the time the juice gets to your house, I've said before, there's no such thing as like an electric sommelier. They can't be like, oh, that's from coal or that's from wind and solar or whatever. So, I mean, and part of it's just the difficulty of the process, like I have some good baseline knowledge. I know people who know way more than I do. Like I wouldn't even deign to debate them on issues that they know more about because I like what could I possibly put up against them? And so part of it's just like the moat around expertise. That's the problem there. And I guess I would say the other thing is like I don't think people really appreciate how important energy is to the economy. And we've lived with it for so long. Like, this is something I sort of toy with in my head. Like, modernity is old now.
Hmm.
Um, you know, and we're in this like weird position, especially right now with everything going on, where we have to figure out how to steward the industrial commons, which has supplied us with a paradox, which is the idea of unending novelty through the refinement of technique and the creation of commodities, which sort of erases the past or makes it feel like an etch a sketch while needing to have these sort of like longer time horizons where you can take care of these things for posterity. Um, and yeah, so I think that those are some of the blind spots that go on. At least those were some of mine once I started getting into this stuff. You know, um, it's hard. It's a hard topic to access. I would say it has taken me a lot of work, and I'm sure people smarter than me could get there faster. But it is inobvious how these things fit together, and I still learn about it every single day.
Yeah. So the kind of the first thing you mentioned is the fact that you can't just be pouring electricity into the grid willy nilly. Is that the reason that there are blackouts across the U.S.?
Yeah, so right now, about like two-thirds of the U.S. is under threat of blackouts. Perhaps. Okay, let me figure out how to approach this. So yes and no is the answer to that question. Um, what happened in America is over the course of several decades, we have restructured our electricity system. It used to be just major monopolies that had regional control and did not compete, and they got a guaranteed rate of profit, and it was their job to provide reliability and to build things. Now, there are all sorts of reasons people got upset with that in the 70s, especially when the energy crisis hits and just hammers the utility industry. I mean, along with everything else. And there was sort of this green movement lying in the wings that was very small is beautiful. And through some decisions made during Carter's tenure in office, into the 90s, especially with the substantial oomph provided by Jeff Skilling and Ken Lay over at Enron, we broke the grid into a series of spot markets. And the way that works is various generators, solar, wind, nuclear, coal, natural gas, whatever, bid into an auction every 5 minutes to provide juice to the grid. And one price sets the clearing price. Some people get priced out, and then everybody else gets paid whatever the clearing price is. So you might be asking yourself, what the hell does that have to do with blackouts? That sounds like it should be fine. Well, electricity is a little bit different than things like natural gas. You can't really store it. It expires in microseconds. And the system has to keep thrumming. If there are interruptions, it creates cascading problems. Now, the way that these markets have interacted with subsidies for renewables and things like that is that they have added entropy to a very complex process. So, how have they added entropy? It's no secret or surprise that when the wind doesn't blow or the sun doesn't shine, wind and solar don't produce. So, when they drop off the grid, they need something to ramp up to meet demand so that it keeps operating at that 60 hertz. And what's that going to be? Just in time natural gas. Now, let's add another layer of problems to this. In order for that market to behave, allegedly, FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission in America, cannot dictate who builds what, and the ISOs, the independent system operators that oversee the auction houses for this bid, can't tell people to keep fuel on site or prefer one form of generation over to another, because that is putting their thumb on the scale and creating unfair market conditions. So these things have combined to fragilize the grid. And we can see how that works when we take a look at lots of coal and nuclear coming off the grid. So reliable energy gets priced out because it can't really compete with basically, I'll pay you to take my renewable energy and
Mhm.
fast acting natural gas, which means that the balancing problems become acute. And when natural gas gets very expensive, as it is right now, when supplies get tight, that creates a serious problem for the grid. So that's where we are today in Capsule. It's a very difficult problem. The rules for the grid are very arcane. They're very surprising and non-intuitive. I'm not sure most people know that ERCOT, the Electricity Reliability Council of Texas, which sort of oversees their grid, in true Texas fashion, is not under the aegis of FERC. They make their own decisions, right? But PJM, which is where I am in Northern Illinois and parts of the seaboard, the Eastern Seaboard, New England has its own ISO, New York has its own ISO, California has its own ISO, and then there's the Midwest Independent System Operator, which is probably the most beleaguered right now. And then there's the Southwest Power Pool. So that's sort of what we're looking at when we see how it's been broken. Now, there's some things that happen, some complications. This didn't really kill monopoly utilities. A lot of that has to do with people getting freaked out by the 2000 California electricity crisis when Enron just ran the boards in California. But that's where we are now, and it's a very hard problem to solve, let alone understand.
Yeah, so the main problem, as it sounds to me, is that by not trying to eliminate monopolies, but essentially kind of disbanding the central node of coordination, you have layers upon layers of agents that have different incentive structures that
Hmm.
get them payouts, and they all essentially feed off of the health of the core system until it breaks in different points. But
That's right.
there's no one really to patch them up because it's not their job, is it?
Yeah, no, the buck always gets passed. I mean, even some of the guys who were the architects of this, like Paul Joskow, who co-authors with Richard Schmalensee Markets for Power, almost at the behest of the Reagan administration at the beginning of the 80s. They're sort of like, how would we do what we did with airlines and trucking or whatever with electricity? They sort of admit that, like, first of all, transmission just is a monopoly. So that's the wires. You can't do anything about that. Like, that has to be. No one wants to go back to the late 19th century or early 20th century where they're just like gobs of spider webs of wires all competing and blocking out the sky basically from view. But now, 3 years ago, in an interview at MIT, Joskow pointed out that the problem I just illustrated was not going to work in the long run. Fossil generate basically wind and solar were free riding off of fossil and nuclear generation, and that enough of those things would shuffle off the grid that we'd be facing the problems we're facing right now.
So this was predicted. I mean, it was clear to see for people who were in the know.
Yeah, yeah, and the more honest brokers, like I like Joskow. I disagree with the entire project, but I think he's an honest man, and a very sharp. He's been very candid that these were going to be problems, that it was going to be a dance between regulation and deregulation, and it's a there's a big bootleggers and Baptists thing that's happening with the grid now that is quite unfortunate. And again, this is the question I come to in American politics generally, but it feels like there's just a famine of people. There's like too many people in charge of things and not enough people responsible for things.
Mm.
If we take a look at like who benefits from wind and solar, it tends to be like financiers or big multinationals that love to sue like middle American townships for putting up resistance against especially wind farms. Like no one likes that shit. No one likes living near it. Um, and it's sort of like who's standing up for these people? Who's my worry is that this is the industrial commons, the grid. As I've said before, everybody needs it. I'm sure as a mother, you're like, I don't want to be like washing my clothes at 3 a.m. I want to be in bed, like I don't want to have to rearrange my whole life to figure out when electricity is going to be cheapest or whatever. You just want it to work. And when a society's elite, so like these finance guys or whatever, start to see their own advantage as undermining the very societal structures that have given them their advantages, that's when I worry a society is in decline. And when I take a look at the American grid, that's what I see.
Yeah. It does feel like this is not specifically, just the grid. Like it feels like
Yeah,
this type of rot, just essentially in terms of who is in charge, who is responsible, what are the incentives for the people who actually get to exert power in this cascading, headless morass that everyone's working in. And it feels like the easiest way is to just eat your way through whatever was built in the past. Like, you see this in other things, like, from building bridges to developing vaccines to all sorts of things.
sure.
Even in the private sector, it's not like, tech is booming. Tech is booming in whatever limbic trap industry. It's not booming in actual, productive directions and especially like long term productive things, or sinecures like renewables. It's booming in those
Yeah.
directions.
Yeah, exactly. And I think something that like is hard to understand or hard to appreciate, certainly it took me a while to really figure this out, is like where environmentalism fits in all of this and what role they play. And they were big boosters of electricity markets because they knew that it would allow wind and solar, smaller operators to compete against the big guys and that they could just dump some subsidies into it. So like Amory Lovins over at the Rocky Mountain Institute, Ralph Kavanaugh over at the Natural Resources Defense Council. These guys have been for the free marketization of the American energy systems before most people who write for like the National Review got there or whatever.
Hmm.
And I think that's something that people need to internalize because it's very easy to say like, oh, like, the left doesn't, there's a certain type of conservative that's like the left hates markets and environmentalism is on the left. They ask for Green New Deals and stuff like that. I mean, first of all, the amount of private capital lining up out the door to take advantage of whatever's going to happen in the Green New Deal is like pretty staggering. But you need to look at the track record. And even what's happening right now with the Tennessee Valley Authority. Right now, there are environmental NGOs that are trying to get people onto the board of the TVA so that they can start prying it apart because it has a monopoly and expose it to greater competition from these mom and pop hyper subsidized wind and solar firms. Like, these people don't care about the progressive legacy. That is not what they are in it for. They just want to build wind and solar because they think the world's going to end, and because they're paymasters, who tend to be the financiers that get all the tax credits, really love building these things. I mean, Warren Buffett's on record as saying, like, the only reason you build a wind turbine is for the tax credit. Otherwise, they don't make sense. Why would you want a generator of power that works sometimes?
It's yeah, it feels like, the all of the incentives are pointing this way. Like I from your perspective, because you said you kind of have a bit of a vision, or kind of an
Mhm.
idea of what this might look like if it were to work. I mean, what does it look like if it were to work?
Yeah, I mean, that's a question that, so I've just actually, I turned in the final edits on this today, a long form piece, like almost 8,000 words or something like that, to
Mhm.
American Affairs, sort of like on sort of like a brief history of the grid from basically the 50s till now. And at the end of it, I'm very frustrated. Sort of like, I don't really know who the constituency is that's going to reform this. And that makes it really hard to make recommendations, right? Because like anybody can sort of like LARP and be like, oh, it would be cool if we did X, Y, or Z. And one of the frustrations that I've had, and this has tempered even some of my own vision or whatever, is talking about what could happen rather than what is happening, because this stuff is happening now. So I'll say this, like, it's very difficult to undo something that's been happening for decades. And this has been happening for decades. I think there needs to be basically some form of centralization, whether that's like one big national spot market, which I'm kind of adverse to because I think the idea for energy markets is, well, electricity markets is flawed to begin with. I get the spot market for natural gas. That makes a little more sense to me. But I really do think that there has to be clear accountability for decisions. Like somebody has to be on the hook.
Mhm.
And I don't really know how that works. Like America may as well have another measure for electricity, which is lawyers per kilowatt hour, because there's so many like regulators and stuff. It's like a lapidary, system of insiders who do all this stuff from the public eye. So how you get there is difficult. So I'd say like the tamest vision I would have is one where people are held accountable for system integrity, and that is like clear and demonstrable to the public. Because I think the knock on effects of a lack of accountability undermine any broader issues in the long run
Yeah.
because they're demoralizing, they're exhausting. I can't tell you how much I hate writing about electricity markets. It is the least fun part of my job. I mean, I'm a like email guy, like, right? I've worked manual labor, like this is pretty cushy, like I like it. It's not a super hard job, but that is definitely the worst part of it. Because it's labyrinthine. It's like a shitty Borges story about numbers. It sucks. Um, you know, uh, and it makes me want to rip what's left of my hair out because I really, I mean, this is where I might sound sentimental, but there is something about this whole situation that makes me over acquainted with the tragic sense of life and history. And people might think that's over dramatic, but unbundling successful systems that have been accumulated over time has unforeseen effects that are really hard to fix later on. And I don't think that there's a lot of appreciation for how that is. I mean, I really think that that would be like a conservative value around this type of thing, that you can't just do whatever you want, that you might want to err on the side of prudence for this, um, for knock on effects, and because you don't know who's going to take advantage of the new framework. And there were plenty of problems with the monopoly utility model, sure. But it was at least clear whose fault it was when things went south. And I'm sure your listeners, especially the ones in America and elsewhere, feel this pervasive sense of foreboding or dread when they think of anyone being on the hook for almost anything at all if they're in power. Right? I mean, what do we need to do? The rosary of this, like the Epstein stuff, like you just sort of go through. And it seems like nobody there's just no feedback mechanism. And that really degrades trust and atomizes people, and I think has that deleterious impact on the nature of citizenship.
Yes, and essentially, the argument again comes back to, a fan favorite of the show, kind of the Curtis Yarvin model. The idea that essentially what you're arguing for is like energy Caesar. There needs to be someone, a
Yeah,
person there, even a kind of a plenipotentiary person who actually has the power, but also is up on the pedestal, ready for people to sledgehammer him down if that's that's what's called for at one point. But yeah, I think it's kind of all downstream from this idea that um, things at this point need to be managed.
mhm,
There's not really, you don't really need to exert power. So not there's no real power in the system. There's only management, and
mhm.
if there's a failure in management, we might replace the manager, or investors might retract their money. Stock prices, everything's very rational in this system, where everything's downstream from a certain science of management of these things. But the problem is they're completely mismanaged if there is no one in power, if there's no actual CEO at the top of the chain of this who actually knows what's going on and has veto power for all these decisions. Then you could throw all that knowledge out the window, because it just erodes in time.
Yeah, the way I tend to think about this is, oh, during the post-war era, when there's sort of like the truce between labor and management, and when everybody understands that growth is sort of what America needs to recover from World War II, because nobody wants to deal with another post-World War One style recession. It's seen as too like just a too dangerous thing to experience, and the labor strikes that happen as soon as Victory Day is declared really freak people out. So they have to figure out how to get everybody on board, and this sort of creates the post-war glorious 30 years, whatever we want to call it, consensus. But I think we should understand that this is also like the accumulation of the managerial class. Right, that's sort of where this all goes. Now, in the 60s and 70s, there's the big crisis of legitimacy about this. And there are legitimate problems with what happens with the managerial class. And everything gets so folded into the war machine in America that it's really hard to disaggregate the good from the bad. Like I, I remember I was talking to a Vietnam vet in grad school, and he was talking to me about drinking in a bar in Saigon with some contractor from some big steel company. And this guy who's telling me the story is sort of like, this basically this sucks shit. Like, this war is awful, it's brutal, there's no point to it. My life is hell, I don't want to be here. And the guy was basically like, yeah, but it's good for US Steel, and paid his tab and walked out. And the turn away from managerialism didn't actually get rid of it. What happens over the 70s, and especially as like cyber culture sort of starts to become a thing, right? It's no surprise that the 60s produces a lot of people who are early cyberspace adopters, is a tick towards decentralization as a way to solve the managerial problem. But really, what that did was create like this rhizomatic managerial structure without any accountable hierarchies. And that's basically what we deal with when we're like online on these major platforms, right? I mean, it's sort of like a million Plutarchian founders that have their HR department that runs your discourse, depending on how they massage the algorithm wherever you may be. And this problem exists not just in the digital space, as we've been talking, but elsewhere. And it seems to be part of a theme that happens after the 70s. I'm sort of like done thinking about the long 60s, as the people used to call it, and I really think it's the long 70s. Like, that's really the hinge to me about what changes in American business and culture. Because like Ford, Carter, and then Reagan are all sort of picking up on the same themes headed in that direction. It's not like Ronald Reagan gets into office and there's this radical break into neoliberalism or whatever the fuck that's supposed to mean.
Yeah, and in your estimation, what's the next phase of this? Because it feels like,
Oof,
like I guess your podcast kind of explains your personal feeling about
sure,
about the
yeah.
situation. Yeah, exhaust, but still, something's got to give. It feels like we're in a tumultuous time. It feels like some sort of change is on the horizon.
Mhm.
But what comes out of this?
Yeah, so I mean, this is the hard school of experience right now, and I think a lot of people were trading on the accomplishments of the past, and those accomplishments are running dry. And a lot of people, like Germany, are sort of waking up to a much ruder reality than they imagined living in. So I think really what happens is these societies that can pull ahead in the future are the societies that can wake up to this reality faster. And the US has some very great advantages here, right? Like if you can sort of like overcome the obstacles that the EPA or the Department of the Interior, like we could be pretty energy sovereign if we want to be. Like that's a political possibility for us as well as an economic one. And so I would hope that our ruling class is not entirely immune to the sobering impact of real world events, but they might be. I mean, I don't know. So that's really what I think. Like going forward, you can't just say microchips or potato chips, it doesn't matter what we make. It does matter, in fact, whether or not you have like a solid energy economy that is your own, where you're not entirely dependent on neighbors or largely dependent on neighbors to run your society. And I do think it matters whether we have a big service economy or whether we have something a little bit more productive, say. You know, I think it matters whether what portion of Americans are basically servants and what portion of Americans are workers. I think that that has sort of cascading effects on morale and on a sense of civic dignity and civic responsibility. So societies that can sort of like wake up to that reality that that's what they need, that they can't just leave it all to chance, and that commodities remain king will do well, I think, in the coming future. Because it's not like things are going to get easier, not for a while. I mean, we're not even really in the energy crisis right now, if we're being honest. We're in like prices are high and inflation is a little weird. Like after this winter, we're in the energy crisis.
So that's what you expect looking
That's
at
what I
the
expect.
data.
Yeah. That's what I expect, sort of just taking a look at it. I mean, a lot of what will happen depends on how the Ukraine situation goes. But I mean, that doesn't really seem to be coming to an end anytime soon. Not that I'm aware of, anyway. I'm not in the halls of power. Like I'm just some guy. What do I know? But from what I can tell, that's not happening. And like the industries that will shut down, I was calling this the Black Cascade last fall. Like I thought this was going to be bad in like I don't know August or September last year, and then the Ukraine thing happened, and I was like, oh no, this is about to get way worse. Because when you see fertilizer industries or chemical industries, like the German chemical industry, is basically like we can't conserve anymore. This is it for us. We either have to like abandon our production or do something else. Like that all flows as inputs into tons of other things. So that creates a lot of problems for everyone else when those things fail. Um, and so, yeah, like I don't think the Ukraine situation is going to get solved. I think it's clear when we're looking at what's going on with Nord Stream 1. Uh, Russia's already kind of saying this is only going to return to something like, I don't know, 20% production of what it once was. Basically, Europe's going to burn through a lot of its reserves. There are no friends in a crisis, so they're going to keep what they have when things get cold. Um, and it's going to be a dark winter for a lot of people. I really feel for the German people. As frustrated as I've been by their government's willingness to just shut down nuclear plants and refire coal lignite plants, which is just like baffling to me. I mean, I don't want anything bad to happen to anybody. This is all so cavalier to me. This is all so short-term thinking that it makes me sick to my stomach. Um, covering some of the things I cover. That's not like a poor me scenario. What I'm talking about is the health of basically societies that I otherwise admire.
Yeah. It just feels like they're like the adults have left the building
Oh yeah.
decades ago. There is no one like there's not that like old guy in the factory who knows how every machine works. He's died like 30 years ago. And
Oh
people are just
yeah.
like, makeshifts, daisy chaining shit now. And it really is, like one of those dystopian sci-fi novels where, people find like a math book, 300 years after everyone's forgotten what math is, and they try to piece together what these symbols mean. And it's really scary. And it's already happened. It's like we're post-apocalypse at this point.
Yeah, I mean, like, we're lucky that we haven't shed all of our institutional knowledge, but I mean, again, that's like another thing that people have been so casual about, you know, that you can just like everybody, like society is just a salamander. You cut off a limb and it just grows back when you need it. That's not really how that works. And I was talking to my stepfather, who worked in manufacturing for a long time, and he said, when some of these plants shut down and then the steel plants have to halt production midway through, and they've got these enormously hot tubs that all this steel is in, and then they just have to shut it down, and then all that stuff hardens into it. He was like, are the guys that know how to fix that still around? Did they get laid off in the 80s? Like, most of this is running on gray hairs who sort of refuse to retire, you know? And I like, look, I don't want to be overly a Cassandra. I only want to point out that we should have greater respect for the material backbone of our societies. Like, that is my number one message, that we should have more regard for the things that we have achieved in the material sphere, not the incredible abundance of commodities or whatever. I don't mean it like that, but the actual forces of production deserve way more care and attention than they have received in the last several decades of at least American existence. It's not that I mean, we still produce things, right? Like here, we still do. And we should be very, very proud of our abilities with things like natural gas. But like, there is such disregard for achievement that I don't, it's just, it's baffling to me. It's baffling. I mean, I can't believe that I went through my life so casually, just being like, well, that's always going to work. Like, I'm not
Yeah.
exempt from this. I'm a guy who arrived here.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, this is actually also an argument in a way that I'm working on, less related to infrastructure material things, but generally kind of how there are a myriad of commons similar to the infrastructural
Mhm.
commons, but even human relationships, what has technology done to human, just like dating, things like that, just like moral norms, what's common sense, how do you interact with someone face to face, like so many little things that we've just kind of applied the most corrosive liquefying agent on top of it, and then we're surprised that nothing works, from our bodies to our infrastructure to all of it. And I guess you're kind of deep in it, and you're essentially kind of the cartographer of the implosion of one of these commons, literally the thing that keeps the lights on. And I can imagine that you are frustrated because you're just essentially learning about a crime that's been committed collect in a way
Yeah.
collectively that no one's paying attention to. And even when you're going to lay out your case and find detail, people are going to be like, oh
Yeah, what do we
well.
do? And hey, look, I can't be mad at that response. I mean, I often just throw up my hands. Look, I've been thinking about this a lot. I was sort of like thinking, like, what would I want to talk to Alex about when I get on this podcast? And I was listening to some of your other episodes, and I was thinking about the idea of when assumptions become optional. And what I mean by that is things that we have held to be sort of true for a long time, right? The achievements that I've sort of talked about, that they need to be taken seriously and stuff like that. When that just becomes an option in a suite of other equally valid options, it is very difficult to articulate the system of values that buttressed the original correct assumption. And usually, the only way that you learn why your forebears might be wiser than you is when the pain level really increases. It is kilowatts to bread. That's the metrics here. Kilowatts to bread. And I mean, I sound like a broken record, but like that is so incredibly important, right? Like there's a Roger Pilkey Jr., who's a climate scientist. He's got this great. I mean, I love Roger. I've followed his work for a while. Um, Not a catastrophist, very clear-eyed, and he calls it the iron law of electricity. People will do whatever it takes to keep the lights on. I had a friend who was in Europe before the Ukraine thing for some sort of pro-nuclear demonstration, and she was talking to an advocate in Europe who was a climate hawk, right? But this person said, I would burn the last tree on this earth to keep my child warm at night.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. And I don't think we've taken that reality seriously enough. It has just seemed like an option. It's an option to have industrial society or not. And I'm not saying there aren't like trade-offs, there aren't like problems. Like I'm a big Christopher Lash guy. I understand that managerialism creates like difficult issues that we have to solve. But if I had to pick between regular rolling blackouts and those like difficult intellectual, cultural, political problems, I'm picking those problems. I like our problems. I like these problems. I don't like where's the clean water going to come from?
Yeah.
That's a problem I don't like. I don't want that. I don't want that for anybody's kids.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's, kind of the looming nightmare that I have kind of in the back of my head as well. Just,
So let me ask you, as a parent, and you moved back to Romania, right? Like
yeah.
that's where. What's the situation looking like where you are? How are people talking about it? How do you think about it?
I mean, there's kind of like almost like a conspiratorial chat. It's very hard to see exactly what's going on. I mean, prices are growing. I mean, they're higher. Inflation's is higher. If I walk down the street, has something changed? No, I'm being made poorer by the day. But like,
Yeah, sure. Yeah,
there's
yeah.
no,
Yeah.
no one's out in the street yet. But there is
Right.
kind of
Tears are
this.
pouring out of your wallet.
Exactly, slowly but surely. Yeah, I mean, I've stockpiled wood, but maybe that's just me being a
Good.
little bit. But that's the thing. We've got like a chimney. And like last winter, we were a bit like, things are gonna pop off when we don't know. It's gonna be
Hmm.
like at the level where, but it might be good. It was -20 here last winter, and I had like a tiny baby, and I thought, if there's rolling blackouts, we're gonna freeze. So we need to do something. So yeah, I mean, a little bit of prepping, a little bit of, I've got like, 3 months worth of food in my house. That's also because, my mom's my neighbor and she's a hoarder and she stashes everything in my basement. So, it's good. It's
Yeah,
good to have
yeah.
that. Yeah, I don't know. It's, like the information infrastructure here is also so weird. I mean, like everywhere, we all get our information from whatever the AP and stuff, and it's all like, oh, but you know what? The government started price fixing, which is a worry because price fixing hasn't happened for a few decades here, and we knew what happened last time. So now
Yeah.
the price for energy is fixed, and it's like tiered. Like the poorer you are, the less you pay for energy, and then they're essentially rolling it onto industry, which is already in deep shit because obviously there's
Ooh.
supply chain stuff happening, and
Yeah.
it's terrible. So yeah, it's looking bad. It's looking bad. No one's panicking yet, but everyone's just like, something's gonna happen.
Sure, exactly. I mean, this is I'm glad that you brought up panic because this is one of the things that I think about all the time now, like crisis politics, right? I mean, I'm sure everybody had their fill during COVID of crisis politics. Um, and sort of like what that does. When I was a kid, I was always confused by FDR's famous phrase, there's nothing to fear but fear itself. I was like, what could that possibly mean? And now, when I take a look at the invocation of crisis, sometimes it's necessary. I'm not saying it never is, right? Um, but when I take the culture of fear and the culture of fragility that seems to have become hegemonic, at least in America, um, you start to realize what I think he meant by that. And that he understood that there were second and third order effects to a society where people are overcome by fear, which inhibits their ability to do what might be right or productive or good for society at large. In other words, it is a limiter, perhaps, on civic virtue at a time when it is highly needed. And so that's what I think about when I take a look at this. Like how many states of exception are going to have to be declared because things just get too bad. And look, there might be practical reasons that's just unavoidable, but that should instruct us on who we should be going through those moments. These things are difficult, they are frightening, but to be overcome by that is to sacrifice the gift itself, the gift of our vitality.
Yes. And it's, even being kind of denizens of the empire in decline is not the worst position anyone's ever been historically.
That's right.
It's a very complex empire, and many things, many big things can go wrong very fast, and not many people know how to fix them. That's for sure. But still, there are things that can be salvaged, or that there are things that we can hang on to, and heroic times call for heroic heroic people. Maybe that's, like you said, it might be I don't know, an invitation for some who feel kind of this emptiness in their lives. I mean, I hope it doesn't have to get too heroic. That's like, I mean, I'm a
Sure.
mother. I don't need to be too heroic. I mean, I love my
Sure.
creature comforts, and the lights especially very important, because they tend to connect to everything else. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's so difficult, right? Like, what sort of how do we make a society like the one that we have, that is complex in the ways that we've talked about, to borrow from Illich, convivial to human freedom? That's still a very live question, perhaps more live than ever after the shocking interconnectedness of these systems is demonstrated to us as things get tougher. We should ask serious questions about that. I'm not saying that I have like answers, but the response to that type of question that I don't like is just get rid of it.
Mhm.
They don't. I don't think that's realistic. I think the costs for that are very high, and that no
Yeah.
one would want to pay them. You know,
Yeah, I mean,
um,
there are some people, who kind of nurse anarcho primitivist fantasies, and it kind of sounds cool if you have like a little shack in the woods next to civilization, and then you can pop in and out, and get your whatever French fries from from the
sure,
nearest
sure.
town, kind of a Walden style escape. But I remember my husband was reading this book, some sort of sci-fi horror, on an EMP, and I was like, "Oh, an EMP. Well, what does an EMP do? Essentially, just like whatever disables your toaster." And he was like, "No, it's literally like almost like a zombie apocalypse thing. It tells you like how people are just resorting to cannibalism and stuff." I'm like,
Hmm.
"Whoa!" And then he just kind of read a little bit from it. I was like, "That could happen from a solar flare."
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
Just
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I I want to say like a few things about sort of the retreat to yeomanism as an instinct. Like, look, going out and living a communal life in the woods is a blessed thing, but early church fathers have been very clear about what that type of life actually means. You don't go out there because it's a retreat from the difficulties of the world. But that is where the darkness is at its height when you are more isolated. It is not just physically demanding, but spiritually very, very taxing and not for everyone. I, I think that gets a little bit undersold in some of those fantasies. And the other thing I would say is like, that seems to be a way to avoid the politics, avoid the difficulties that we have to walk through of very old questions that are hard to answer, which is who's in charge, who owns what, and who benefits. I think it's clear kind of who benefits from some of what's going on, but maybe they shouldn't be the ones that benefit from what's going on, you know? So I think that while I completely understand and wish anyone luck who is doing that journey in a non condescending way, because like I said, I think it's a blessed task to do such a thing. I would not recommend that as a societal solution to the troubles we're facing right now.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of the, idea that you can just, grow your own food and, be self-sustaining and things like that. If you plug into the supply chain system where, you get your fertilizer from X and then you get, there's so many like intermediary products that go into yeah, just the
Sure. Well, and the other thing is, like, we can take a look at Lebanon. My friend, good friend, and mentor Robert Bryce has covered this. There's a great Wired article that goes into it. The Generator Mafias, right? So Lebanon has a very fragile grid, and there are basically guys that are a mafia who controls who gets access to generators and who doesn't. And they are the main obstacle to a centralized national grid because it would put them out of business. What might that look like in a Western context? Well, in California, which has one of these spot markets, right? California's diesel backup fleet, because the grid has gotten so fragile here, is now equal to 15% of the entire grid. It is 24 times the size of the state's battery fleet. This is the fraying of the industrial commons because those diesel backups get put, of course, in poor neighborhoods, but are for the service of the wealthier Californians. That's how this is going to go. There's not going to be some return to homesteading. There's not going to be some more agrarian future out there for us. You know, I'm not saying times won't be difficult. I'm not saying that climate change isn't real. I believe it is. That's why I like nuclear. But we're going to have to learn to adapt. And we're lucky that Prometheanism is a part of the human experience. And we shouldn't denigrate that, just like we shouldn't put it on a pedestal. Practical arts like politics, spiritual elements of our existence are important too. And I think that's sort of what gets me frustrated about my other friends in the energy space is that um, it is easy to oversell the importance of the electricity grid because it is so vital. But we don't want to lose the human dimension in service of the industrial system either. It's a difficult balance to strike. Nobody's done it perfectly. But again, I'd rather have that problem.
yeah. You mentioned that you're not a believer in progress.
Yeah, that's right.
I mean, how does that how does that tie into your beliefs about energy? I mean, um,
Yeah. So part of it's, as I said, that we've always been Promethean. I think that there's a way that people sort of buy into the propaganda of the Enlightenment where they think like, oh, the end of like superstition or whatever. Like that is not what happened there. Or like, the Renaissance is really when we started doing cool shit with technology. It's like, I think you're not respecting the Middle Ages enough. There's a lot of interesting stuff that gets built and done there too. This has always been something that we've been doing. There's a guy actually, a Mont Pelerin guy, John Constable, who I really like. He and I disagree on all sorts of things, but he's a smarter than me, I like reading his stuff. And B, very, very perceptive. He's this guy who can walk in both worlds. He's humanity's guy who covers energy. So I sort of relate to him in that way. But he points out that the Industrial Revolution isn't really a revolution that the way people think it is. If you look at it, it's really an accumulation of energy over time. And the phrase Industrial Revolution gets used by people talking about the political situations and the industrial situations in Britain and France, and then in like absorbed into the Marxian framework for how to talk about the coal age, which is nascent and exploding at the time that he's writing. But it is really a misnomer because, again, we had all sorts of farming techniques, the original energy policy, all sorts of other things that we were doing that were feeding into the refinement of technique. Now, if you want to reduce progress to the refinement of technique, and I'm sure some do, you can kind of say, like, well, history is progressive. But I don't think that's honest. I think people that say that also mean that there's this moral dimension that's there that I'm not convinced is there. So if the Industrial Revolution isn't this radical break, but is rather like a exponential accumulation of resources, technique, and ability, what does that mean for us? It means that the time horizons get very long. You can't just, it's not like, Michael Scott from The Office, like I declare bankruptcy. You can't just declare an energy revolution, right? You can't, or an energy transition. Nothing works that way. It never has, you know? So when I say that I don't believe in the progress of history, I think we can look to all sorts of horrific things that have happened with the refinement of technique that have always been part of the human experience, frankly. That doesn't mean things are getting worse. It means that to some degree they're still the same, just with new toys. The difficulties of running a society, I think, are relatively the same. Regime types, more or less the same. Again, new toys, new features, new things to think about, but basically the same. And it is our task to gird our society against the forces of entropy. Energy has greatly expanded our ability to do that. Like a house is a system, it is the reduction of entropy to serve the family, right? By providing shelter, by all of these things. Say the same thing about the grid. Now, where does that put us now? I have a pet theory. I have nothing to back this up. This is just what I think about when I stare at a wall. That as we have reduced our exposure to entropy in the natural world, which is not a nurturing mother, as we've reduced that entropy, we have expanded our psychic entropy. And a lot of that has to come with the problems of modernity, what we were talking about before, the optionalization of everything. This is, I think, our fundamental task today. How do we steward something as liquid as modernity? Is that even possible? How does our regime survive? And who gets to be in charge and benefit from it? Are the livest questions I can think of right now.
Yeah.
And to me, they have nothing to do with the progress of history.
Yeah.
These are, in fact, the oldest political concerns you can possibly find.
No, I completely agree. And I feel like there's unfortunately it seems like this is kind of the conclusion that's looming, that there's almost like um a zero sum balance between how much abundance and comfort a population can
Mhm.
have and how much entropy it can, until the balance swings back. And then that whole abundance and comfort gets wiped out just because of, the kind of the inner entropy, the psychological entropy that just kind of,
Sure.
hollows out the individual that would be in charge of the grid or
Sure.
whoever.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, yeah, it's the rice paddy to rice paddy in 3 generations thing.
Yeah.
That's sort of the problem. Um, and yeah, so that's an old problem. But look, I'll put it this way, right? So uh, here's an interesting fact. If we're worried about climate change, if we understand that people will do whatever it takes to get electricity, And there are good reasons why they would want it that we sort of take for granted, those of us who have it. Um, what are we going to do? I mean, this is part of why I like nuclear, right? Because they're just going to build coal. That's the deal. The amount of coal that's exploding by this time next year will have canceled out America's emissions reductions since 2005. So we can either do like an Atoms for Peace 2.0, where we figure out how to help the developing world build nuclear, because otherwise they're building coal, or Rosatom, Russia's national nuclear entity, which is, by the way, the best in the world, will do it for them. Anybody who's interested in grand strategy or even concerned about what a multipolar world might mean maybe would want some leverage there.
Mm, yeah. This is this is the main multipolar question, and not only on this. And it might be the case that Russia is not alone in this endeavor. I'm sure China might have something to say
Oh,
about this.
China's great too. They're building. I mean, just nobody can compare. Like, look, Rosatom's a freak of nature. It gets broken apart in the 90s and then reformed under Putin. I mean, like, in the early aughts, for people who don't know, he really restructures the Russian energy economy. And I have to say, like, how that gets handled is very deft. Like, I'm not a fan, but I do respect
His
uh,
this work
that level
in
of achievement.
particular.
Yeah, I do respect what happens there. That's why Gazprom is such a big titan in Europe right now, and why it's such a big problem, right? It gives him a certain amount of power. And they like recongealed Rosatom to be this international powerhouse that delivers quality nuclear reactors on time, on budget, for people who need them, people who don't have the insane fears of radiation that Americans have for reasons I go into in a very long piece in American Affairs you can go read, um, and who want those kilowatts and who don't want the coal. I mean, if you get a nuclear plant, that does so much for your society. It adds a level of labor sophistication, of ability, which, by the way, doesn't need to be super credentialed. The only thing the Simpsons get right about nuclear energy is that somebody without a college degree can support a big family and own a house, right? That's what's beautiful about nuclear to me, is that the big and the small work together. It creates an ecosystem of trade organizations, local pipe fitters unions and stuff like that around it. That's why I call them industrial cathedrals. They can last for up to 100 years and supply that sort of community togetherness through labor that really matters. There's no surprise that these countries want this. It's no surprise that our decadent society has lost sight of what that might mean to us and why that should be important.
Yeah, it's incredibly efficient because I mean, looking into kind of what our energy mix is in Romania because I wasn't aware of that, and just saying we've got two reactors in one place, and they supply almost 20% of all of the energy in the country.
Yeah. Yeah, that sounds right. And you could get even more out of it if you so and China and Russia are already working on this, on taking the excess steam from nuclear and turning it into a form of district heat. Like, I mean, we're talking about a level of sophistication and provision for society, again, through important, dignified labor that I think is very, very vital to societal health on not just the physical commodities and goods front, you know. And that's part of where I think we are. We're sort of faced with these choices, and when we look at our leadership class, there's much to be disappointed by anywhere in the world. The fact that Germany is even in this situation is a black mark on anyone who's been in charge over there. It is like, it's just so fucking stupid. I'm sorry. Like, so reckless, you know, like so reckless. Such elite decadence, that German minister who ends up working for Gazprom after cutting these deals. It's so gnarly. And the thing is it hurts Germany's neighbors as well. Like Europe is pretty connected energy wise. And look, they're not the only ones. France, in a way even less more dumb and less efficient than Germany, pursued a similar energy-venda policy, which has led to the denigration and lack of care, disrespect for their incredible nuclear fleet. Right. And now it's running into corrosion problems that people don't know how to solve. Well, there are a lot of places in Europe right now that are trying to conserve their gas supply, and they could really use exports from France's EDF to stay afloat right now. France could use that, frankly. That's why they're making a move to nationalize it now.
Yeah. Are there any serious arguments against nuclear that you think deserve attention, or is there any argument that you think is, yeah, that's a good objection or a useful objection?
Well, I think that, like, if I'm going to be honest from just a technical standpoint, no. But if people are really concerned about the consolidation of industrial forces and the centralization of power in service of technology, there are sharp and difficult critiques to overcome there if you want to give those people room in the debate. And so I think that there is, I mean, the socialists love to say just put public ownership on it and it resolves that problem. And that's not entirely incorrect, but seems to sort of like miss the point of the concerns of the anti tech crowd that I think are very real. The conviviality thing that we were talking about before, you know. And so I think rather than saying like that's an unserious argument that you shouldn't have to pay attention to because electricity or whatever is so important, we should really talk about what trade-offs look like. And that's the way to encounter that argument, because the whole plan that we were going to do a decentralized, more convivial, like renewables and biomass thing has led to greater managerial consolidation, farther away from public control, and even more difficult to understand because it has added entropy and unnecessary complexity. And so it has not really provided the reality of the anti tech vision. So I'd say that that's like, maybe it's just me because I'm in some ways a return bro, over invested in my opponent's arguments in that way, and I find them the most interesting or the most compelling because it just technically it's the best. It
Okay.
just is. The waste is the best part. It's the easiest to handle. It's the most safely stored. It's the most energy dense with the fewest negative trade offs you can get out of any industrial system. And it lasts the longest, unlike coal plants. Nuclear ages like fine wine. It gets better over time as you refurbish it. Like in America, well, some of our plants operate at above, like they operate at almost at 90% or above capacity. That's crazy. That's crazy successful, you know. And I've already sort of talked through the labor, big and small, working together, sort of thing. So, um, people might be worried about like weapons or stuff like that. It would be like beyond the movie The Rock with Sean Connery to figure out how to turn the waste into weapons. Level of like, I don't know, ne'er do wells getting up to that. I think it's just the safest and the best. So I've read tons and tons of critiques and have found all of them coming up short.
Yes, I was actually, I just read a few kind of bullet points prepared by whatever think tanks or something like that before coming in, and even to me, an untrained eye, they all seemed retarded. Like, and just it's just the things like at the moment, 444 plants supply 11% of global electricity. That was the stat that they came up with. It's been estimated by their calculations that you need around 15,000 plants in the world to supply the global grid, which just doesn't seem to to
Yeah,
work
it
out
sounds
that way.
great.
Yeah, I mean, even so, it's essentially that was their argument that imagine if you're scared at 444, how scared will you be at 15,000? How many?
Right. The fear of big numbers type thing. Yeah.
Exactly.
So here's a good back pocket thing for people that might not be convinced. Again, you can check out some of my articles on this or whatever on the history of nuclear and how it came to be demonized and how it's in fact part of the American nuclear establishment's fault that people are scared of radiation when I don't really think that they should be. If you've ever taken a plane, you've been more exposed to radiation than any nuclear plant would expose you to, probably. Um, but one of the things that I learned from Robert Bryce is that the lower your energy density, the higher your resource intensity, right? So if we take a solar farm, a wind farm, not very energy dense, the capacity factor, which is basically what people talk about, like, okay, let's say this is 15 megawatts or whatever. How often are you going to get that amount of electricity from it? Say 15% of the time, 30% of the time for solar, wind, depending on the season. And you need a lot of land and a lot of resources to harness that energy, right? Nuclear has the smaller land footprint. Like a buddy and I, Adrian, we wrote a piece for the Bellows on this, and we sort of did some back of the napkin math, and we were like, well, what would it take to do wind and solar for the entire US grid based on 2019 consumption? And it would take up the size of like Ohio, 80% of Ohio. And you're like, oh, that's not too big, maybe. Then we compared that to what it would be for nuclear, and it was smaller than the size of Chicago, where I live. So you're talking about all of that natural land. And we didn't even factor in transmission lines because you have to build these things far from where the energy is needed because that's where the weather's the best for them, and then build big transmission lines to hook them up. So the lower your energy density, the higher your resource intensity, right? That's really the transition that gets sort of misunderstood about coal. The reason why we did coal is because it is more energy dense than wood.
Mhm.
Right? England starts running out of wood. They start buying it from America. Anybody will do what they can to keep the children warm at night. So they're just walking into the forest and chopping down whatever the fuck they feel like. That's the way that goes. People will find a way, uh, and that's why nuclear is so impressive as an achievement. It is very, very fascinating to me that it ever came to be at all. It is even more fascinating that it's one of the first times society has seen an increase in energy density and then walked away from it.
Yeah. On
That's the
almost,
fascinating problem.
I think there might be an element of kind of these vivid, kind of images, or kind of this vivid imaginary that's related to accidents. And to me it seems
Sure,
like whenever
yeah.
I talk to someone about nuclear, they're like, oh, fallout. It's very much tied to the media. It's very much tied to all sorts of either movies or you know
There's a great
cultural.
book on that, honestly,
Yeah.
by David Nywert called The Rise of Nuclear Fear. And what he even traces it back to like ancient myths
Mm.
and things like that. But that it is really about this diffusion of images that create our lexicon for discussing dangers around nuclear. And again, to give people who were frightened of nuclear their due, some of them I think were basically evil Malthusians who knew exactly what they were doing. But just for the random person that was just like, I don't know what this is, I don't know what's going on. 3 Mile Island, nobody got hurt, horribly handled by the
Yeah.
industry, just like the worst comms ever. I mean, that Netflix documentary is basically bullshit. You can check out
I've
Decouple
seen it,
Studios.
and I was
Yeah.
like, and then we're just waiting, like, so how who died? What's going on? And we
Yeah,
were
what
like
what
just
happened
waiting
here?
to
Yeah.
see. So what
Yeah,
happened?
what's going on? Yeah. And I think it is very hard for us today to understand the first of all, the to use a term that's oversold these days, the trauma of the post-war experience. I mean, a lot of assumptions about how history was going to move and the nature of human beings was evaporated by those experiences, and not for no reason. People were very scared because of things that they had seen and experienced. And I don't want to be cheap and discount that. And when you see sort of these grand strategy, Cold War, nuclear missile psychos, it's really difficult to not say, well, the utility guys who build nuclear have a relationship with the state, and these things seem to be related. and is all part of this like cabal of old white dudes who seem to fucking run everything around me. And I don't like that. You can sort of create a sympathetic account for why people didn't trust what was happening there. And look, sometimes that trust was broken. I mean, I found this fascinating quote from Betty Furness, the actress who was like the lady of Westinghouse, used to be one of the premier nuclear reactor builders. Now they're more of a decommissioning company. But they built tons of appliances, and she was sort of like Ronald Reagan was for General Electric. She was like the person who was the face of their advertising. And by the 60s and 70s, she's saying stuff like, you gave us Teflon and didn't tell us it would kill the cat. Like you gave us the pill and didn't tell us we were guinea pigs. She has this whole list of ways in which people felt betrayed by the post-war pro-growth managerial, heavy in the commodities, uh, industrial complex that had supplied America with its opulence. So if we can sort of contextualize all of that there and then see what the energy crisis and stagflation did in the 70s to that entire mode of thinking and operating, I think we can come up with a more nuanced, appreciative account of why this paradigm shift happened at all.
Yes, I think it's interesting because I have one memory of a conversation I had with my dad when I was younger. My dad died when I was fairly young, but he was a hydroelectric engineer. He
Hell
was
yeah.
building
That
hydro
rules.
plants
That's so cool.
all over the Soviet Union, obviously, because that was, he was kind of like a top guy in his field, one of those old white guys, literally, who was, building these things, doing the upkeep and everything. I remember, he, explained to me how the microwave works and all sorts of little things that I just remember. And I remember him having a rant about nuclear. And he said, it's a miracle. And he was like, you could see like a sparkle in his eyes because, he obviously built the hydro plants and then they took them to, plants in the Soviet Union. He worked on the Chernobyl plant here because it's on the Danube. And I think it's part of a hydro complex as well. So he was there when they, set things up.
God, that's
Um,
so amazing, Alex. That's what a fantastic man he was. Wow.
Yeah, he was. I mean, he was like an inventor. He had so many patents to his name. He like spoke
Oh,
7
I'm tearing
languages.
up.
Like yeah, I mean,
How fantastic.
yeah, I know. He was like, I'm a child of a second marriage, so he was quite old. He was, when I was
Sure,
17, he died
sure.
when he was like 67 or, just the way things happen. But yeah, he's just awesome guy. And I just that's one thing I remember that he was so bullish on nuclear.
Yeah, man,
it's,
yeah.
it's part of our family lore. So how could I not be? And how could I not, invite someone as knowledgeable as you to, give me a bit more context about why I should be bullish on nuclear?
Yeah.
I mean, hopefully other people see the light too. And before I let you go, I want to ask
Yeah.
you the question of the show. Everyone gets asked this question. Do you have a subversive thinker, living or dead, whoever you think is interesting, that people underestimate or, yeah, that's just underrated that people should check out?
Yeah, God, I thought about this and it was so hard. It was so hard,
It
because
is.
the other thing is, like, I don't really know, like, what's subversive. Like, things feel very protean right now.
Yeah.
So I'll say that, like, I mentioned I don't know how subversive he is, but I think people should read Christopher Lash's book, The True and Only Heaven:
Mhm.
Progress and Its Critics. I think
Yeah,
it's a
that's the best
fascinating.
Lash,
Yeah,
the
it
best
is.
Lash
It's
book.
I mean, John Updike, who was his roommate at Harvard, said that it was
Really?
his magnum opus. Yeah,
Oh, man.
they were sort of competing against each other as fiction writers. And then at some point, Lash understood that Updike had surpassed him, and he was like, "I think I'll become a historian." Um,
Good.
but
Arwen.
yeah, and Updike used to say that Lash had that, Hemingway-esque plain style. And so when Lash went to write the sort of writing manual for students at the University of Rochester, in a nod to Updike, he titled it Plain Style. Um, but it's a fantastic book. There's plenty to think of there. Over at Exhaust, behind our paywall on Patreon, we did the whole thing. We
Mm,
read through the entire thing chapter by chapter. If you want some thinking partners for going through that and to sort of motivate you to move chapter to chapter, you can check that out. But with or without us, I think people should. That's that real shit from
yeah,
him. You know,
that's excellent.
yeah. Okay. And I got to get out of this room real quick. I will say everybody should reread The Republic every couple of years.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much, Emmett. This was super informative. Just the best, summary of the situation. And thank you so much for coming on. This has been a long time coming.
Yeah, thank
I'll
you so
see you
much for
around.
having me. Catch you later.
Cheers. Bye.